Mr. Sterne, Mr. Trewhitt, Mr. Corddry, members of the Council and guests, we certainly welcome you this evening to the third annual Sun Papers panel, which we're delighted as a Council to host. We'd like to especially thank the ASABLE Company for hosting the reception this evening. Please allow me to make three quick announcements. Our next guest will be the Honorable Richard B. Parker, the former American ambassador to Lebanon and presently the editor of the Middle East Journal. Last spring, after the Lebanese ambassador spoke, we decided that we would seek an American expert on Lebanon, and Mr. Parker was recommended to us as a man of deep experience and serious scholarship, and an ideal person to speak on Lebanon. And as it has worked out, unfortunately, Lebanon is in the limelight, but because of that, we're especially pleased to have Ambassador Parker as our next guest, Tuesday, November 23rd, here in this room at the same time, reception at 5, address at 5:40. On the 9th of December, the Honorable William E. Colby, formerly the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, who has most recently indicated some support of the nuclear freeze movement, will speak on the topic nuclear arms. Can they be controlled? And that will be again in this room at 5 p.m. with the address at 5:40. And our guest on December the 13th, a Monday evening, over at the Hyatt Regency with a reception at 5:30 and address at 6, will be His Excellency Moshe Renz, the Ambassador of Israel to the United States, addressing the topic, the Israeli view of the path to peace in the Middle East. This evening's schedule, unless Mr. Sterne suggests otherwise, will be as we've held it in the past, that each of the panelists will make a short statement and then make observations about their colleagues' remarks as they think appropriate, and then the floor will be open to questions, and we'll ask you to address your questions directly to the panelists. Our session will end promptly at 7 p.m. That's congenial also. I would now like to introduce the chairman of our Board of Trustees, Mr. John Brumman, who's the vice chairman of the Board of Trustees of Black & Decker. Mr. Brumman.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the meeting. I'm sure that it's delightful to see how many people have turned out, and I can see your circulation is going to be going up any time now. At midterm, the principles of President Reagan's foreign policy are being tested. Long-term American policy on the Middle East is at a critical point. Strategic policy is issued, and midterm elections may affect the President's ability to persevere in his policies. At this important juncture, we're certainly fortunate to be joined by this panel of seasoned and very distinguished Sun Paper journalists. Mr. Sterne, who's in the center, it's not necessarily about politics, is now the editor of the editorial page of the Sun, joined the Sun Papers in 1953. He has served as chief of the London Bureau, the Bonn Bureau, and assistant chief of the Washington Bureau. He's travelled extensively in Europe, the Soviet Union, Middle East, Africa, and recently came back from Japan. Mr. Henry Trewhitt, who's on the left wing today, joined the Sun in 1956 after 7 years as a journalist and following study at Harvard as a Nieman Fellow. He has served as chief of the Bonn Bureau and as the paper's defense correspondent. He interrupted his tenure at the Sun to serve as diplomatic and White House correspondent for Newsweek magazine, during which time his book, McNamara, His Ordeal in the Pentagon, was published. He returned to the Sun, as you can see, in 1974, since which time he's been the paper's diplomatic correspondent and analyst. Mr. Charles Corddry is the military correspondent of the Sun. He joined the United Press in 1941 and was the Pentagon correspondent of the United Press International at the time he joined the Sun Paper's Washington Bureau in 1967. Mr. Corddry has been a regular panelist since 1967 on the public broadcasting's program Washington Week in Review, and as you know, that's an award-winning public affairs program. So without any further introduction, except to point out that Mr. Corddry is indeed the one on the right, we'll get on with the panel. Thank you.
On their left.
I want to welcome all of you here. It's really a great pleasure and an honor for us at the Sun to be involved in this panel. It's now become a tradition. We're in our third year, and I'm very pleased we were introduced with the admonition subtly slipped in there that our introductory comments are supposed to be short. I kept mine short last year, but my colleagues, being television stars and so on, did not. But maybe this year they will. I'm a little worried about the title that you all brought in here with, the midterm elections and Reagan foreign policy. Because if you look at this past election, you could hardly tell that foreign policy was an issue. The one issue that might have come up was the nuclear freeze proposal. But if you think about it, that was really something brought from elements outside the political establishment. People who really are trying to bring their views about the control of nuclear weapons in through other means than the political parties. Nevertheless, this could change because, as we know, at least two of the hopefuls for the Democratic nomination in 1984 did pick up on this. The other hidden issue, which I might want to speak about a little bit more in a minute, is protectionism. This could have become a flaming political issue, except that I find most politicians in both parties are so scared of the issue that they will run with the crowd as much as possible. And we again see the two leading Democratic contenders for the presidency starting to talk in a very protectionist way. So that it could be that one issue outside the political stream of the election could emerge in '84 as a political issue, a partisan issue, which would be the nuclear freeze proposal. And I think possibly protectionism could also come to the fore as a very major issue, unless it is so major that it transcends both parties. I was very interested to note that President Carter had to admonish his Vice President, Mr. Mondale, for talking this protectionist line. I find in doing a little bit of research that it's not unusual for a midterm election to really go slow on foreign policy. Back in 1946, Henry Wallace and his inclinations towards the left were a bit of a political issue. In 1950, the Republicans raised the charge of corruption and communism against Truman. And in 1954, you again had a lot of Cold War dialogue between the two parties. In 1958, there was talk about Kamoy and Matsu and the Sputnik problem. And at that time, the Republicans, of course, being the in party, were on the defensive. With the Democratic theme, the Republicans weren't doing much of the job. 1962, that became a non-election as far as foreign policy is concerned, because the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted right before the voting. President Kennedy went back to the White House, adopted the Rose Garden strategy, and nobody dared say a word about foreign policy while the fate of the world was hanging. In 1966 and 1970, Vietnam was an issue, but it was really not a sharply partisan issue. In 1974, we had Watergate. So you can see the pattern really isn't for foreign policy to come to the fore. For one reason, you have hawks and doves in both parties. And for another, in this year, the focus of attention was almost entirely on economics. Now, We would say, well, if it's economics, then it's not a foreign policy election. But of course, this is wrong, because the economics issue, as it was addressed in this election, really is one of the most important foreign policy issues that affect this country. We're in a stage now where we've had worldwide recession. We have record interest rates. We have financial institutions terribly exposed by $540 billion worth of debts to third world countries that might not ever be paid. You have chronic unemployment, which is toppling governments in Western Europe, governments to the left, governments to the right. So if you think in terms of the debate over President Reagan's economic policy, in terms of how it impacts on the world, and you think also that protectionism might well be one of the leading issues that faces this country in the next 10 years, then really in a subtle way, this was a foreign policy election. Before I turn it over to my colleagues, I'd like to just give you a little list of some of the things that have happened since we last met, so it might give some people some ideas for some questions. Let's not focus only on one issue as we sometimes have. But in the last year, we've had martial law in Poland, had the invasion of Lebanon. We have Schultz substituted for Haig at the State Department, had the Falklands War. We've had socialist Democrat governments elected in Greece, Spain, and Sweden. We've had Schmidt fall in Germany. Suzuki is resigning in Japan. We've had the Iran-Iraq war going on. We've had a little bit of the Chinese-Soviet thaw. We've had this tremendous Mexican financial crisis, which has alerted the whole world to the possibilities of financial collapse. And that, of course, is tied in very much with the president's economic policy. We've had the pipeline controversy. We've had the nuclear freeze movement. We've had the Afghanistan war drawing the Soviets ever deeper. We've had the start of SALT talks and intermediate range weapons talk. We've had the El Salvador elections and the whole turmoil in Central America. We've had a greater turnaround in the oil supply picture, and yet at the same time we've had this worldwide recession. So a lot's happening, and the worldwide recession has become so much worse in the past year that I think we're seeing a lot of governments in trouble, incumbents in trouble. And on that note, I'll turn things over first to Mr. Trewhitt, who will talk mainly on diplomatic affairs, and then Mr. Corddry on military.
Let me just pick up, ladies and gentlemen, where Joe left off. The administration, as he correctly says, does not face pressure for new directions in foreign policy, with probably the exception of a message in regard to the nuclear freeze, virtue of the election results, except it coincides with other events which will tend, I think, to cause the administration to move in some new directions in foreign policy and perhaps accelerate the pace of movements that we already see. We are entering the Schultz era in the State Department, and we can already see some of the changes by virtue of the new secretary's influence within the administration. I must say that he does it much more quietly than his predecessor did. I may have referred to a couple of reasons last year as to why we, in fact, are going to miss the old Secretary of State. But in case I didn't, I may have forgotten to suggest that his successor, whoever he might be, would never say, "We must avoid posturing ourselves in this confrontational mode," which is one of the former Secretary's philosophical approaches to foreign policy. And he also referred to something being at this juncture of maturization, which I think George Schultz would probably never say, which is one way of saying that Schultz is dull. You can already, however, as I suggested, see his influence in several things. Let me mention the two most, I think, most dramatic ones. One is in the question of what we all know as the pipeline affair. attempt by the president over the weekend to lift the sanctions on the basis of some sort of agreement within the Western Alliance about new terms for East-West trade was in fact a cosmetic exercise, which did not come off very well. But the fact is that he did. And that is what is important in the context of these relations, because in the first place, the anti-ally relationship simply could not have survived under the strains that existed. Now, we can talk a little bit later about the conditions under which that developed throughout. It would take much too long to recite it here. But that is one area where you can see a direct result of the new secretary's influence, and it was exercised more on the President of the United States than it was on the Western Allies. The other is in Middle East policy. There is no question that Secretary Shultz is inclined to bring greater pressure to bear on Israel as he works for a formula which brings Israel and, what for lack of a better term we call the moderate Arabs together in some kind of negotiations over the future of the Palestinians and the occupied territories. It depends on your perspective, but that's a good thing. But the fact is that the Secretary is more inclined to be impatient with Israel than Secretary Haig was, and we can see some evidence of that in the President has had to say since Mr. Shultz came to office, most especially the September 1 speech outlining his terms for what he thinks ought to be the outline of the Middle East settlement. Those are two. The third, and we're only seeing a glimmer of that, and I am not sure whether it would be proper to attribute it to the new Secretary's influence or not, but it is a very slow process of moderation in the approach to Central America. The Secretary Shultz is less inclined to apply the male fist in Central America. And I must say that I happen to be one of those who never thought that Secretary Haig would have been prepared to use military force in Central America, because I think he was smart enough to know that the American public simply would not stand for that. And I think what he was doing essentially with the threatening language he was using over the last year and a half was posturing, which in itself is never or very rarely a good tactic to employ in foreign policy. Nonetheless, we're seeing efforts to find another way to find a solution to the American foreign policy problem in Central America, which is a problem. Certainly the overwhelming number of Americans would agree that to the extent that Central America falls under the control of hostile governments, whatever their political coloration, it is not in American interest. It's a truism. And no administration is going to tolerate it without resistance. The question is how you try to offset it and how you try to bring it under control. I think if the Shultz influence is successful, you will see it with greater emphasis on economic programs in the region and effective political negotiation, which will perhaps make use of force unnecessary. The great problem, of course, is El Salvador. The administration hoped it had the beginning of a saving formula in El Salvador with the elections last March. It is increasingly looks as if that is not the case. The right wing which came to power in El Salvador is failing to get the message, and we will have to see what happens before January, whether the administration, one, on the basis of its own evaluation, can bring itself to consider continuing aid to that government, or whether it will simply have to back away and let the government fall and try to resist the political movement in that region in other states and by other countries. We simply don't know. But I think that gives us, again, some areas to talk about. We can discuss which I suppose is the single most significant of this in terms of foreign policy change we talk about here is the pipeline. But we'll leave that for that. I'm sure these questions that.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, now that you know all about our foreign policy, I have been introduced as being on the right wing here.
May I say that I spoke for 2 seconds less than Joe did?
I can even do better than that. I feel whether I've told any of you the story of a sign in England which read that had to do with infant mortality and child care. So I read that the first few moments of life are the most dangerous, and someone had inked in underneath that the last few are a bit tricky too. Being out here on the right wing in the presence of my employer, right at the tricky stage. I think that we probably could all agree that power does play a role in the world, and that little countries choose up sides and see how the big, depending on how the big countries are going. And that you do have to have a certain amount of military power to back up the foreign policies that you have, as you just heard explained. And that the Reagan administration came into power thinking that there simply wasn't enough. It had put into effect a large program. It's not as much larger than previous programs have been as you might think. It's for perhaps $300 billion over 5 years, more than Carter would have done, maybe. But in any event, it is now going to come under scrutiny, and I've said to this group for the past 2 years that I thought the program was too big and would be cut. I've been wrong both times. Mr. Reagan has had his way, and in order to keep my record intact, I'm going to predict now it will be cut, and see what happens. But I reckon that defense has problems in 3 areas, and the first is in the domestic, and it's perfectly obvious that when Mr. Reagan had the enormous defense buildup, he also thought that supply-side economics would provide all the money he wanted. It hasn't. We've got a poorly performing economy, and Congress, which gave him everything he wanted on defense in the past 2 years, very well may not do so next year. I think that probably working for the president on his defense program, and mind you, if you thought you heard him say the other night he compromised, the White House and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff explained the next day that no, indeed, he was not making compromise. Probably working to his advantage is the change in government in Moscow. Since we can sit here tonight and debate continuity, emphasis on military power, emphasis on détente, emphasis on arms control, in other words, the same old stuff, the president can argue, and I should think that he would, there was a glimpse of that in his press conference, that this is hardly the time to be rolling back, that you're not going to negotiate successfully with the Soviet Union if you cut the military power out from under me. I think this will carry a lot of weight in Congress, and to that I would add that the programs over the past 2 years have gained a great deal of momentum, and however much talk you hear about cuts, you have to keep in mind that they haven't got down to the voting yet. Finally, there are structural problems in the defense program, and this is why I suspect that it ought to be rearranged. They try to buy everything, and maybe they needed everything, but they try to buy it all at once, and this is what's got them into trouble. I won't cite any figures unless under great duress and questioning you force me to. But true. Carter was going ahead at a real rate of growth, 3% a year. He was forced to go to 5% a year. Reagan went to 7% a year. And in fact, the first year or two, Reagan went much higher. This may very well have to be cut back. But I would think that the place where the president would really kick up his heels would be that point at which he was pushed behind where Mr. Carter was. I can't imagine that. That's about the way I think I'd like to leave it on defense now, and we'll see what the questions are.
Let me just say one thing before we take questions. Since Henry brought up the matter of George Shultz, I think we ought to keep in mind that one of the most interesting aspects of Shultz's background is that he is an economist. And he's not only an economist, but he's brought in 2 other economists as his top aides in the State Department. So I think that we have a State Department that is oriented to the trade and financial crisis that is facing this world and understands the interlock between the trade and financial crisis and Reagan economic policy. So let's go.
Well, on the matter of weapons, I'm sure both Mr. Corddry and Mr. Trewhitt are well acquainted with Mr. Nitze and General Rowney, who are our chief negotiators over in Europe, are negotiating with the Russians on nuclear weapons reduction. Arthur Macy Cox, in his book on Russian roulette, says that putting these two, Nitze and Rowney, in charge of negotiations to reduce nuclear weapons is based on what they have said publicly in the past, like putting the fox in charge of the hen house. What would be your appraisal from what you know of those gentlemen?
Sure, go ahead.
Well, I think it's basically an irrelevant remark because both of these men, I know Charlie was General like Browning much better than I do. I've known Nixon for longer than I care to remember. He is going, first of all, to do what he's told, which means that he is going to reflect the administration's arms control and strategic policy. Now, you can disagree with that policy, or you can oppose it, or you can subscribe to it. But Nitze is a strategic thinker who has a pretty good track record over the last 40 years, I guess, in seeing where strategic developments were going. And I think whatever my policy was, now obviously he would not have been compatible negotiating for Jimmy Carter for that matter. But if I had a centrist arms control policy, and I wanted an experienced, highly intelligent negotiator to carry the water for me in Geneva with the Soviets, I think I probably would have called Nitze. I think probably what Mr. Cox would say is that he disagreed with the policy. But as you well know, he disagrees with the policy. So I think in basic, I come back to my original point. I think it's basically irrelevant.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, we are not sending Mr. Nitze and Mr. Rowney to Geneva to negotiate arms increases with the Soviet Union. And the Fox in the ticket booth suggests that they are. But this Rowney's a Baltimore boy, for heaven's sake. You know he's going to do well. The fact of the matter is the President has proposed a radical departure in arms control negotiations. General Rowney was a participant in working out the plan. He didn't agree with all of it, didn't disagree with any of what came out. And I think that he and Nitze will sit across the table and stare the Russians down, myself, and I think we have not had a habit of doing that in the past. We have tended to negotiate both sides of the issue before we send our team off to negotiate. We would sit down and say, oh, the Russians wouldn't accept that, so let's not propose it. This hasn't happened this time.
Let me try to bridge a couple of points that are always implicit in this kind of discussion. And they relate to what is possible in arms control. People who generally take the position, well, why don't we freeze, or why don't we reduce arms control by X level? Why don't we stop building nuclear weapons, which most people actually would not argue. Tend to forget that there are ingredients in these discussions which have to be bridged in every case. The SALT II treaty, for example, was, I think, probably, in the judgment of most Americans, a reasonable treaty. It was not ratified. And it does absolutely no good whatever to produce a treaty that cannot be ratified. It may make some people feel good, but it doesn't lead to arms control. So there's always this conflict between what is possible, what is reasonable, and what is extreme. And there's a constant effort, anyway, always to bridge that. And the personality of the people who are doing the negotiating obviously will have something to do with the success or failure of the negotiation. But I suppose it's entirely possible for a negotiator who is so far out of harmony with his president that he could perhaps scuttle a negotiating position, but I have great difficulty seeing that happen. So it's something we always have to keep in mind.
I think we also ought to keep in mind some of the continuity here. When Carter came into the presidency, a lot of people think he made his first big foreign policy mistake by not taking the Ford-Vladivostok agreement and getting it through the Senate and getting it ratified in a hurry. Instead, he came up with a proposal which, at least in character, is not much different from what Reagan has proposed, which was a radical reduction in arms. And then his second mistake was to retreat very quickly from that proposal just as soon as the Russians started raising objections, and then, of course, we had the long protracted negotiations to the point where we finally had a treaty but no chance of ratification because conditions had changed so much in Afghanistan had occurred. One thing I will say for the SALT II treaty, it's true it's not ratified, but it is being observed by both powers, which I think reinforces what Henry said, which is that it probably was a reasonable treaty for both sides. Another question? Yes.
This is a question directed to each of you individually, if I may. If you were the President of the United States, each of you, what gesture specifically would you make, or what posture would you adopt now, at this moment, in dealing with the new General Secretary of the Soviet Union?
Well, I'd be perfectly willing to answer the question. I would reinforce my previous arms control proposals, because that's really the main point of contact between Washington and Moscow, attempting to put a lid on the arms race, as we say. The President has done that, and I think he was very wise in doing that. And that's what I would do.
If I were President, I would try very hard to repair our relationships with our Western European allies, particularly to get off some of the counterproductive and divisive policies and actions and directions that have been initiated by this administration, and try to have a fairly solid Western position with which to confront a government that is going to be very hesitant and unpredictable.
I suppose my first choice would be to try to use the interim period in the Soviet Union, the new leadership, and shaking down and showing its tendencies, inclination for the power is going to come to rest as much as one can, because believe me, there's going to be a lot of interesting things happening in the Soviet Union over the next year. So while I try to repair my relationships within the Western Alliance to the extent that I could, I might try to do something dramatic. I think a cheap shot sometimes, like come close to adopting the freeze proposal or some such thing as that. So it wouldn't mean very much in the context of our negotiations, and yeah, you could probably do, I think I will do a lot of good stuff.
Yes.
In the matter of the war in Vietnam, many of those in this room spoke up against the government and were joined by millions of others. Would you say that on the matter of nuclear disarmament and all the proposals in front of us, if the people spoke up, much as the Catholic Church is presently looking at the document on the entire matter, they could have an overwhelming effect on the outcome as they did before, and if the Senate, the people, Congress, the President take notice?
Yes, they did before, I'm sorry.
Would you say that the people could use the same power that they did before as the Catholic, and in that context, what would you say is the importance of the Catholic Church in the aggression that's now making of the issue?
It certainly would have an impact. The consequences, I dare say, would be different. My reaction to that would be that it is, first of all, you have to ask what you mean by the various proposals for nuclear control. I believe, without exception, all of the freeze proposals call for verified freeze. Now, verified freeze, as you can extrapolate for, you see, leads you instantly into a new set of negotiations. No alternative to that, unless you're just going to say, okay, we stop and we're not going to worry about it, so let's do it. Which I don't think really very many people really advocate. So what are you talking about? You're talking about entering a new set of negotiations. It's certainly going to take a long time, and try to freeze weapons levels where they are today, the day the negotiations begin, or the day the negotiations conclude, which may be 1 year, or 2 years, or 3 years, or 4 years, or 5 years down the road. Meantime, what will have happened to your IMF and START negotiations that are already underway? I don't know. I just make the point that there is nothing practically out there on the horizon that calls for a quick freeze in nuclear weapons development. I really know no one serious in this area who really believes that an agreement could be reached easily, and above all, verifies that agreement could be reached easily. So, which also leads me just to gratuitous to suggest that a lot of people who spoke out for the freeze are totally cynical about it. I personally would think that you could freeze nuclear weapons at the levels at which they exist today, without trying to take into account what's going to happen in the meantime while you're negotiating an agreement. We would probably be in splendid shape. As a practical matter, that is not possible. So, first of all, you have to set a frame of reference. But to answer your question directly, yes, if the public mobilizes, it can, in fact, do almost anything with almost any administration in this country. I dare say the Reagan administration would never yield on the most simplistic terms I've just said here, but it could force a change in the negotiating part of the administration. But you have to ask yourself, again, a whole stream of questions that arise from what I just said. One, are they serious about it? Two, what are going to be the conditions under which it is extremely complicated. The basic answer to your question is yes.
I have here Harrison Salisbury's Without Fear or Favor, an uncompromising look at the New York Times. And one thing he makes clear is that there's an awful lot of fear and favor, particularly in the field of foreign policy brought by the government. And Kennedy said, you knew about the bad pigs, you should have stopped me. But they said, well, the New York Times would have wound up with egg on its face. I don't see why it would have. I don't see why they didn't say, we know about the Bay of Pigs. We know it's going to be a flop. I don't understand why papers take this attitude.
I think you've raised a question. We can have another session tomorrow evening at the same time, same place. No others. I would say this. You've raised a very serious question, and it's a question that newspapers have to always confront, and that is this. We are in the business of information. We are in the business of getting as much information as we can to as many readers as our circulation department can round up. That's our business. And no newspaper man in this country certainly likes the thought of suppressing any information that comes to him that he feels is legitimate and true. On the other hand, we happen to be also citizens of this country. And there are times in war or near war situations where it might be very easy in the abstract with 20/20 hindsight to say a newspaper should have done such and such. But when American lives are on the line and American security is on the line, there are constraints. I would say this, though, that by and large, the American press becomes more convinced through the years that probably the best policy in the end is to let it all hang out, because we also have been taught by recent history quite vividly that how national interest is defined by our leaders might not necessarily be the national interest. So that we always are confronted with these terrible judgment decisions. It's not a matter of our being intimidated by our government, thank God, which we are not. Nobody's ever tried to intimidate me. I doubt if anybody would dare to do that to General Corddry. But on the other hand, we do have certain responsibilities as citizens, as responsible citizens.
May I ask a question as to whether our president missed a great opportunity in not attending the Brezhnev funeral?
Well, my reaction is it's probably not. I don't know what he would have done once he got there. You're really talking about essentially about a protocol propaganda undertaking. The president there's no way he could go in and begin negotiations or make proposals to Yuri Andropov, because Andropov just got his mandate 2 days ago, and he's still sorting out things within his own structure. Now, this is completely apart from whether the president would be the proper person to try to present a complicated proposal of some kind to the General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party anyway. But the Soviets, I'm told, believe that what we did was just about, as no doubt, was just about right. And nobody was ready for serious negotiations yet. And you'll recall that there was some change of messages before they decided who would be in a delegation from the United States. So that became pretty clear in that process about the level of representation. Time will come later. That question will be much better.
Just to show that there's no unanimity on the Baltimore Sun, I would disagree on that and think that this would, no, I would disagree about the president's decision not to go to Moscow. I think this would have been Henry's cheap shot, offered right on a silver platter. And most important, it goes back to the point I made before. I think it would have helped us in our relations with our Western allies in the battle for Western European public opinion. I think this is where, yes, would have probably been wise.
I don't think it would have made a dime's worth of difference.
There you are.
Mr. Corddry, Mr. Trewhitt, the so-called window of vulnerability, does it exist? What is it? Your colleague Richard O'Mara says it's a scathing political lie.
Well, you want me to start?
Let me say that since Mr. O'Mara is the foreign editor of the Baltimore Sun, and I am the diplomatic correspondent of the Baltimore Sun, I think that's a wonderful observation. I would disagree with that in several respects. One is that the window of vulnerability is a lie. There are many strategists in this country who think that a window of vulnerability exists or is opening. So ergo, it cannot be a lie. Now, they may be wrong. And I guess my perception is, as I said already, I would in the abstract support a freeze. So I guess what I'm suggesting is that there is no highly dangerous window of vulnerability at the moment. But if you extrapolate all the figures that are there, then it is quite possible, probable that the strategic gap is going to be opening more and more unless something is done about it, which is one of the reasons it's such a terrible problem with GMX. Nobody knows what to do with the bloody thing. And yet there's perception on the part of some people who worry seriously about such things that in fact such a window of vulnerability is going to be opening over the next few years. So that's the kind of thing you're dealing with. It seems to me it's just, you cannot give a black and white answer to that.
The expression came into some use during the Carter administration. To those who use it and know what they're talking about, it has a distinct and definite meaning. It refers to a period during which the Soviet Union would have a sufficiently greater stock of strategic nuclear power than we do, that it could threaten to knock out our strategic nuclear power in ways that we could not successfully retaliate against the Soviet Union, and that they could therefore intimidate and blackmail us on the international scene. That such a period will come, I cannot tell you yes, I cannot tell you no. That both Democrats and Republicans in possession of the facts believe that it could come, I can tell you the answer is yes. There is one other point I would make. To compare 1982 with 1962 is plain ridiculous. In 1962, or 1960 rather, we did not know what the Soviet Union had except what we could get from cloak and dagger guys, most of whom died when we got to them. Today we can count everything they've got beyond peradventure of a doubt. There is no doubt whatsoever that the United States knows precisely what the Soviet Union has in strategic nuclear power, where it is, and what's on top of every one of them. There is no doubt of this. Certainly there is no doubt what we have. If you think numbers count, there are possibilities for a window of vulnerability. And that is the simple, pure answer to the question. If you were to ask me whether I think it matters, I would say I have to give you an entirely different answer, but that isn't what you asked.
Well, why don't you answer that?
I thought you'd never put me I think it matters if the world comes to believe that the Soviet Union could push this country around. I think it got to the point in 1979 where the world was beginning to believe that, where the people of this country believed that, and that is why Jimmy Carter got off the dime and began to increase its defense budget. Now, I do not think today that the Soviet Union can intimidate us unless we just say, well, go ahead and do it, which has got not very much to do with military power. But the thing that is important, where Hank and I disagree, if I understand what he said, is that if you were to freeze the levels of nuclear delivery vehicles today, ours would wear out before theirs did. And that's why I don't think there will be a nuclear freeze, because they would then be frozen into a position where they could gain something that might be called superiority. And if you're going to tell me Henry Kissinger once asked what God's name is that, I will tell you that it was booked within a footnote saying I was tired that night.
Let me just add a point to that, too, because it relates directly to what Charlie was saying. According to my understanding of any reasonable approach to a nuclear freeze, it would have to involve equivalent forces, rather than, as Charlie suggests, that American forces would wear out because they're older. But what I'm suggesting is any freeze agreement that can possibly be reached is going to have to provide for replacement forces.
Well, I think it is, but there is not in any of the proposals that have been brought forward.
We traditionally talk about the United States and the Soviet Union as being adversaries, so why don't we look at some areas in which the United States and the Soviet Union are cooperating? For instance, what about the American delegation of some corporate heads that are in Russia presently? And what do you think are going to come out of those talks? Because I understand that there is supposed to be bringing about some type of mutual corporate cooperation between the two nations. Is it true?
I'm not aware of the trip, but I dare say I really shouldn't speculate. There's going to be a lot of activity now over the next few weeks as people try to recover from the lifting of from the sanctions that were imposed on the pipeline site. I don't know whether that's it.
No, I'm not. But I don't think that matters because all these such trips constantly occur. There are all kinds of trade exchanges and cultural exchanges. And my response to your question is yes. I think that the United States and Soviet Union have the most complicated relationship of any two nations on earth, and that they have to be in contact and will be in contact with one another. And we've been talking about nuclear arms and confrontation tonight. There is another side of this picture that I think the facts of the world are such that they will be an adversary. There is a genuine competition between the two countries for spheres of influence. There are very deep philosophical differences between the two countries, and I think that we just have to accept that there has to be a balancing of cooperation and competition, and hope that this relationship doesn't lead to something bad. I really couldn't go much beyond responding to that.
I'd like to ask all of you, why is it that the United States said we would be the first one to make a nuclear strike? And Russia came out and said, no, we will not make the first nuclear strike. Will you please explain that?
Well, I would first like to say that words are cheap.
Excuse me, but that's the way we negotiate. If we think everything Russia says is cheap, they think everything we say is cheap. When are we going to get down and talk some sense?
Well, as I say, I still think that words are cheap in regard to the way the Soviet Union deals with some of these questions for propagandistic purpose. The other thing comes down to the military position in Central Europe. If you count the force on both sides, and you realize the numbers of Soviet tanks and Soviet troops, which Charlie Corddry could give you right off the top of his head, as against the NATO side, one of the problems has been that we really haven't had the conventional forces to make a deterrent without at least keeping this threat of the first use of nuclear force in the background. Now that's been the rationale throughout the years, and what is happening, I think, is that there are political currents running through Western Europe, which very well might make this an untenable situation politically for the United States, particularly if there's something done to stop it before the first includes. But at that point, you have to ask yourself whether the Western governments are going to make the investment in conventional forces that the Soviet Union.
No, just one thing, that your question does raise this question. No matter what the Soviet Union has said, no matter what the United States has said, can you imagine now the superpowers going to war and one soliciting in and saying, well, I promised not to do it, and so I won't. And this is really why nobody pays any attention to what the President said about not engaging first use. The reason that we don't undertake such a statement, if I understand it, is that, and I know that some very honorable gentlemen who put all the nukes in Europe are now asking us to declare they won't use them. And this is the truth. But I mean, the reasons are two. First, you create such an uncertainty in the Soviet Union's mind that you have an additional deterrent, and this is what nuclear weapons are all about. They don't know whether you use them or not if you don't tell them, and so they will hang back. Also, if you tell them you won't use them, then they can mass their forces for an attack much easier than if they're uncertain about the use of nuclear weapons. So to the people in charge of these matters, it has never seemed to be a sensible thing to do. And by the people in charge of these matters, I refer to the leaders of the 14 nations that are concerned, not just ours.
I'd like to say that we are spending billions of dollars on weapons that we will never use.
I hope you're right about that.
Well, it is just a waste of money. Why don't we start talking some sense? I mean, if the economy is going down, jobs, every military jobs are too
what is the point here? That since we're making nuclear weapons, we should use them? Surely not mean that.
Well, why are we making them if we're not going to use them? I mean, this is my point. I mean, seriously, it's different if we just had 20. We have 50,000 of them. What are we still?
We do not have 50,000.
I don't know, but it's what difference does it make if it only takes one megaton bomb to destroy half of America?
That's
so what
not
difference
so
does it make in numbers?
Well, I mean, that's simply the case.
All right, I'm going to be chairman here. Next question.
Please, may I ask you what are we doing about the rapprochement between Soviet Union and China? Are we prepared to counterbalance and do something about it? Because I understand, actually, it is addressed to both gentlemen, it's both defense and foreign policy. I understand, I don't know, Mr. Corddry knows the number, how many divisions of Soviets are occupied on Russian fronts. If they are liberated, that's tragic for Europe.
That's why China is such a supporter of NATO.
You'll recall that this is not the first time, of course, that there have been efforts to get rapprochement between the Soviet Union and China. I dare say, certainly, there's a great deal of gamesmanship involved on either side. The question is where basic interests come down. And the United States is banking on the proposition that basic interest still requires that the Soviet Union and China to keep sufficient distance, political distance from each other, that that it will not result in strategic damage to the United States. The principal issue, of course, in Sino-American relations is, of course, the question of Taiwan. I have to say that nothing that has happened in the context of American support for Taiwan since the signing of the Taiwan Relations Agreement and recognition of China beginning in 1979 seems to me to be beyond the minimum necessary if the agreement was to mean anything at all. That has always been my perception of the Chinese understanding in those private conversations that are supposed to be a guide to what the Chinese really think. Now, the Chinese public position, they have opposed the Taiwan Relations Act from the very beginning, have said that it has no effect on the joint relations between, or on, it can't have no effect as far as they're concerned in the context of the United States relations in the Western Pacific. And we have taken that as being a cosmetic device to cover their own future policy. If they have been leading us down the garden path, nothing that has happened in recent history since that occurred, it seems to me, would have made any difference whatever. Because the United States surely has not gone beyond what the Chinese must have expected if they understood the Americans correctly at the time they actually signed. So I happen to think that they're simply playing the game of both ends against the middle and have no intention of moving back into the kind of strategic relationship with the Soviet Union that could get them crushed in the process. But they're certainly not in a position to take on the Soviet.
What's gentleman there?
I've read a report on their 30,000 tanks in the Middle East out of Russia. What do you three gentlemen know about it? It is a good report.
How many?
30,000 tanks.
Soviet Union is not credited with the 40,000, I think, 10,000.
30,000 in the Middle East.
I simply don't believe it.
I just don't believe it.
I don't think it's even close.
I mean, there are ISS figures on that are always within 3 or 4% of being totally accurate on tank strength in every country. But
There are 30,000.
I think you're saying it's wrong. In fact, I'm sure. Yes.
Sterne, regarding what you said a bit ago about the scare passage, I'm skeptical. One of the about the quality of, I'm asking about the quality of the Russian nuclear power. Now, there are other equipment, certainly doesn't seem to be much if they have to use a sledgehammer to close their breach of the block of the gun in the tank. If they have an airplane that was brought to Japan that's made out of steel instead of titanium and sophisticated things, if our men overseas had 21 ratio in fighting against it, then why are we so afraid of them? I don't care how many they have, if they fall apart in the field, they're no good.
I don't know that we're afraid of them. I haven't got that impression.
Scare tactics.
Well, scare tactics, that's another thing. But the airplane that you referred to, and I don't know how much detail you want here, that was taken to Japan and didn't turn out any good. The Danish Air Force watches it fly over the Baltic all the time at 2,000 miles per hour, no matter what it's made out of. So don't underrate the Foxbat. You hear that stuff about our own equipment too, and all military forces are always terrible. They can't make anything work. But somehow or other, the Russians managed to put it together when they were taking Berlin, and they probably could manage again if they really were put to the test. I think it'd be a mistake to overestimate them, but I think it's a terrible mistake to believe that all you just said is really right down the line.
History backs it up, because when did the Russians ever come through anything technically? The weather was what killed Napoleon, and then also Hitler, and they even Japan tore them apart with their little ships.
I'm not sure that that's pertinent to.
Right now.
I don't know, Joe, whether refighting the Battle of 1905 is what we're
I'd love to hear what positive things, what positive trends, what bright spots do you happen to see in foreign policy today? Something we can look forward to.
I'll be glad to start that. I'm very happy that we have an economist as Secretary of State, as I suggested earlier, because I think unless we start solving these economic problems in the world, we have stagnant trade now. This compares to an 8.5% increase each year in world trade during the 1960s and early 70s. We have stagnant trade now. We have a situation where the private banks are so overextended that they're not daring to lend developing countries private funds, and therefore this is just accelerating the decline. So I would say the brightest thing in my book that happened during the year was that we got a man in as Secretary of State who will focus on these economic problems. You want to switch price about it?
No.
Okay.
You almost have to define your terms in the question like that, I guess. And I think it's perfectly splendid to have a Secretary of State who is economist. I question, I don't know yet whether he has a strategic view. I don't know how he's going to do the infighting within the administration, because as near as I can tell, he is the essential voice of moderation within the foreign policy establishment that consists of people who know nothing about foreign policy at all, beginning with the president. So I don't say this to denigrate the president. He simply has no experience in this area. And he does not seem inclined to hit the books. And if you think I'm belittling the president in this regard, let me then immediately cite President Carter, who studied foreign policy until 1 a.m. in all of his spare time and didn't do so remarkably either. So I'm just citing the reality. The three people who are the closest advisors to the president, have no experience in foreign policy at all. The assistant to the president for national security is a close friend of the president, and you'll all remember his confirmation hearings a year and a half ago when he became Deputy Secretary of State. I have no reason to believe that he has studied foreign policy as a student since then. I think he's in the job he's in because the president is comfortable with him, and he knows how the president likes to work, what the president's style is, and he can provide the president information and advice and those who the president finds comfortable. And you have a Secretary of Defense who is essentially an administrator. And I don't know if I need to repeat myself, but I observed in a piece I wrote last week. The Secretary of State of Defense has the grace to say that he sometimes errs by committing foreign policy.
You're not answering my question.
I'm arguing. Yes, that's right. I'm arguing with Joe. That we muddle through. If you asked the same question 10 years ago, I would probably be giving you the same rather bleak answer because things don't happen that way. If we had just signed the SALT Treaty, I would be citing that treaty as a great development. But I'm not sure what it would mean in that context. If it worked, fine. If it didn't work, not so fine. We muddle through, and sorry.
I think I ought to tell you that Tony Barbieri, our correspondent in Moscow, sometimes came back to talk to me when he was in Washington because Hank scared him to death. I have a bright spot on the horizon, but it'll give me that it must be a distant horizon. But I really do think that both the United States and the Soviet Union are going to have to come to grips with a matter of arms control. And I don't know when, but I do think it's coming, and that I think would be a very bright spot.
Mr. Speaker, touching on the foreign trade that we're trying to build up in this country, China being a virgin territory, we sent a mission, industrial trade mission to China. The Chinese said they'd love to do business with the United States mission, the United States government, and they wanted to order 20,000 buses. Our representatives opened a leaflet up and showed them, said, well, this is our specification of buses. And the Chinese representative said, I'm sorry, our streets are narrow. These buses are too wide. And the steering wheel should be put on the right-hand side, which we are accustomed to the British methods of steering a vehicle this size. And they said, well, there it is. You can take it or leave it. The Japanese mission came in there and said to them, what would you like to have? We'd like to have a bus 5 feet an hour, 10 foot longer, steering wheel on the right-hand side. They wrote it down, they completed the contract. You will have your buses within 6 months. Well, that just gives you a slight example of why our foreign mission, our foreign trade, is going down the creek. Thank you.
I'd like to respond to that just for a second by saying I just got back from Japan, and I must say that I was impressed by the record that they have achieved in foreign trade too. We are going to be running a $21 billion merchandise deficit in trade with Japan this year. $21 billion. And one of the reasons that they're doing so well is that they get away from looking at short-term profits and look at long-term share of market. Another reason they're doing well is because they learn foreign languages, and we don't learn foreign languages.
Correct.
Another reason is that they send people in much greater numbers to develop markets over a long haul, and they adapt their products better than we often do to the needs of the market they're trying to hit. So I think you and I are in the same way. Yes.
What will the deployment of the Pershing II missiles do for us or to us? And do you think that the deployment will make nuclear exchange more likely or less likely?
I can't see how it would make it more likely, but I could see how if I was sitting in Moscow, I could exploit that argument because it's 10 minutes away. But there are to be, how many, 108 all told. Hardly enough to destroy the Soviet Union on their own. And I can't see it as a worrisome thing to the Russians, but if I were in charge of the propaganda department, I would certainly push that line for all it's worth. The purpose of the thing, of course, is to get the Soviet unions to negotiate lower levels on these things. And if they become convinced the Pershing's coming, the cruise missiles coming, they probably will come to some sort of agreement with Paul Nitze, to use a name that's been bandied about.
Yeah, if I don't call on my old colleague, Dudley Digg, I'm going to be in trouble.
All of our panelists have made reference to different aspects of this arms negotiation. Nuclear-free proposals in this country sold to, I think Mr. Sterne made reference to the fact, sold to is in fact being reserved by voting policy. We're going to try to sum up the other references. One question. Is there any reason why the start talks now should not end up approximately the way that SALT II ended, be made into, if you will, a politically saleable package and then back?
I don't think we're all being silent. I think we're all thinking.
Well, Doug, it seems to me that is the direction you're going to go. Certainly the United States does not expect that its solid start proposal is going to be accepted. And certainly the Soviet Union doesn't expect that mysterious proposal, which was on some detail, that they propose is going to be accepted. There's going to be a meeting now somewhere, and it is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of SALT II, probably. But
we get up there in, say, a year and a half?
it depends on how well the new Soviet government and Ronald Reagan get along over the next year and a half. If they see it in their mutual interest to have a bang-up signing ceremony at Vienna or Geneva in just before the campaign really heats up in 1984, the answer to that probably will be yes. It's a matter, as you know, I've been down this road as long as I have, it's as much a matter of political will as anything else. It's quite popular.
Turning to the bright spot, let me ask you how you respond to this hypothesis. Going back to the nuclear freeze, you're stating that you believe that there will be an approach to reduction of military arms economy. Certainly that's what the world would seek, a substantial reduction. In the absence of it, we either lead to more and more bankruptcy of the world or to nuclear war, and we don't want either. Isn't it possible that the nuclear freeze, very important in its own way, is nevertheless a political beachhead of potentially extraordinary importance, expressing maybe just for the first time a political discontent in the United States with the march towards nuclear, escalating nuclear arms, combined with the tremendous financial pressures that are being exerted by the defense budget, huge deficits, increasing deficits, tremendous cuts in domestic programs, that Americans have moved from the beachhead to a discontent and a refusal to accept these budgets. We're beginning now for the first time to hear members of Congress talk seriously and find it politically acceptable to talk about reduction in the defense budget. I heard Daniel Yankovic, who's a pretty darn good opinion research fellow, say he felt the transcendent political issue of the 80s was going to be nuclear war. That if you see this pressure mounting as a political force on the United States, in which the administrations, this one or the next one or the next, have to feel they're dealing with a circumstance where they must be more creative, more aggressive, in finding a way to reduce the level of militarism. Isn't it possible that those same forces exist within the Soviet Union, pressing for better consumer goods, pressing for, and among the leaders in the Soviet Union, not up to the same political eruption, but among the leaders in the Soviet Union. And therefore, out of the very crisis of these times, financial situation, the threat, the fear of nuclear war, out of these things could come these critical new steps that should really lead us to a substantial dismantling of arms and armaments as the fundamental means of security.
Okay, it's hard for me to make the connection that you just made. I think first that the tendency today is to overlook the fact that the Soviet Union and the United States have not gone to war, although there have been plenty of reasons that they might have since 1945. There must be a reason that they didn't. Second, the pressures that you mentioned are all on the American government. They're none on the Soviet government. You dream if you think Andropov is going to listen to somebody marching in the streets and threatening off with anti-nuclear.
I'm feeling like this would suck.
It will not happen. You will have a more repressive Soviet Union in the future. But having said all that, what I think that you may overlook is that the nuclear freeze movement more parallels the American effort to negotiate arms control than stimulates it. And I mean, this is a matter of opinion, but that happens to be mine. And I think that the search for arms control is based on